Greetings, and welcome to this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus. Now, for a dialogue about beautiful speeches, and that contains some of the most beautiful speeches in all of Plato, the Phaedrus seems to be thrown together. It falls into two main parts, whose connection with each other is far from obvious. The great challenge of the Phaedrus, then, is to grasp the beauty of the whole. In the first half of the dialogue, Socrates and his young friend Phaedrus share three speeches about love. The first of these speeches is by the orator Lysias. Phaedrus was very impressed by Lysias' speech and has written out a copy which he reads to Socrates. In it, Lysias speaks as a non-lover, that is, an older man who seeks to persuade a youth to become intimate with him, even though he, the older man, does not love the youth. Socrates criticizes the speech, but not for its morals, rather for its arrangement as a speech. He says that he can do better. So Socrates offers a second speech, which he says he heard from someone unnamed. Socrates speaks with his head covered in shame, for Socrates also speaks as a non-lover. Now this speech characterizes lovers as mad, and hence harmful to their beloveds. After making this speech, Socrates says that he must purify himself, since he has been impious to the god, love, eros. Thus he offers the third speech, which he attributes to the poet Stesichorus. Socrates calls this third speech a palinode, a recantation. It is one of his most famous speeches. In it he says that various forms of madness are good for us, not bad. The best of these is love. Now, to prove that claim, Socrates says that the souls of the gods and all other beings circle a vast hyper-Uranian space, in which being itself resides. The immortals gaze on being forever. However, through their own injustice, mortal souls sometimes fall into the bodies of men and other animals. The task of life, then, is to love well, that is, through justice, to fly back to the contemplation of being. For the human soul, Socrates claims, is like a chariot, with a charioteer who's trying to manage two horses, one noble and high-minded, the other rude and lustful. When the charioteer and the noble horse conquer, the soul flies upward in its love. When the base horse wins out, the soul sinks into bodily pleasures and falls farther away from being. So much then for the three speeches that form the first half of the Phaedrus. Phaedrus is very impressed by the beauty of Socrates' palinode. As a result, he and Socrates take up the question, what makes a speech beautiful? So the first half culminates in a beautiful speech. The second half examines what makes speeches beautiful. At a first pass, then, beauty, the beauty of speeches in particular, is the link between the two halves of the dialogue. So, in the second half, Socrates and Phaedrus first discuss rhetoric. Socrates reveals a very thorough knowledge of rhetorical techniques. But all these techniques, he argues, are only what come before rhetoric. He suggests that rhetoric depends upon knowledge, namely knowing the truth about one's subject and about the souls of all those whom one is trying to persuade. So rhetorical art is a tool. Knowledge is primary. Knowledge of the soul and the whole of things. Without this knowledge, a rhetorician would be like a man who knows a lot about drugs, but knows nothing about sickness or health. So where does one get this knowledge? Socrates argues that it comes through dialectic, the art of dividing and collecting subjects based on their likenesses and their dissimilarities. Socrates, in fact, calls himself a lover of these activities. Then, in the very last part of the dialogue, Socrates and Phaedrus consider written speeches and their effects on readers. At best, Socrates argues, writing serves as a reminder to the writer of something he's seen, as well as a seed in the soul of the reader, which, through dialectics, may blossom into knowledge. For the static written page cannot capture the motion of dialectics. Beautiful speeches, then, inspire reflection, dialectical insight, and an ascent toward knowledge. They cannot do your thinking for you, but they can inflame a desire to know, a love that will raise the soul towards being. Perhaps love, then, is the connection between the two parts of the dialogue. So, how then are beauty and love related? That's the fundamental question of the Phaedrus. It is a question that's embodied in the two characters themselves. Phaedrus is a beauty. He inspires love in others. He's a beloved. Socrates, in contrast, presents himself as a lover of speeches and of dialectics. However, there's a wrinkle here. Socrates does not love speeches for their own sake. Near the start of the dialogue, Socrates says that his main business is understanding himself. So Socrates loves speech without treating speech as most important, which is an odd sort of lover. Now this stance helps explain Socrates' treatment of the three speeches in the first half of the dialogue. Lysias' speech he scorns as conventional. It tricks itself out as daring, but really it just argues for friends with benefits. It suppresses the mad nature of love. The second speech starts from love's nature, as madness, but it doesn't investigate that nature. Indeed, by looking directly at nature, Socrates says, the second speech sets up the speaker to become blinded. So you could say Socrates' transition from Lysias' speech to the second speech mirrors the transition from sophistry to natural science. But it's a transition that Socrates is not satisfied with. So he moves in the third speech to myth. However, unlike the traditional myths, which place the gods above all else, Socrates' myth treats the gods as second best, looking up to being. Truly, it is a myth about the soul. The transition then from the second speech to the palinode mirrors the transition from natural philosophy to political philosophy. The hyper-Uranian vision of that which is would seem to supply the knowledge of the soul, which according to the second half of this dialogue grounds true rhetoric. But there's a question here. Is such knowledge possible? Phaedrus believes it is. And with this realization we come to perhaps the deepest source of the union of the two parts of the dialogue, Phaedrus himself. After all, Socrates composes his speeches here not just for anyone, but with a view towards the soul of his young friend. Phaedrus is, as he says, the head of the dialogue. He practically compels Socrates to follow him outside the city walls to hear Lysias' speech. Phaedrus revels in rhetoric's ability to deceive, but he also believes that rhetoric can capture the truth, the whole truth about the soul and all things. Now Socrates calls himself a lover of speaking and of speeches, as well as a lover of learning. In contrast, Phaedrus is, as he says, delighted by speech, a bacchant and a reveler. Phaedrus makes speeches and he inspires speeches from others. In other words, he generates, he does not desire. Phaedrus stands in for the god, Eros. Eros, the god, causes Eros the desire. Eros does not feel Eros. So Phaedrus represents the god, the beautiful. That is why he interests Socrates. For this Eros seems somehow the whole of things. The chariot, the charioteer, the horses, the gods, the universe, and the forms beyond. Perhaps this promise of completeness is what it means to be beautiful. And this is exactly what Socrates recognizes he lacks. Socrates is not beautiful, he's ugly. He is not beloved, he loves. He is erotic, he is not eros. He is not beautiful, but he is good. And this, then, is the ultimate bit of dialectic in the dialogue, bringing together and separating Socrates and Phaedrus. And this is just one more example of how Plato's dialogues avoid the pitfalls of writing and embody the living, breathing speech of one who knows. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus.